Okay, welcome back to Gary's Economics. Today we are going to explain one of the biggest and most misunderstood economic questions of our time. Why is housing so expensive? Okay, so this is obviously pretty much the biggest economic question everybody wants to know. You might be asking why we've not covered it on the channel before. And the answer is that we did cover it because it was obviously such a big issue. This was one of the first videos we ever shot on this channel, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. If you want to see me back when I used to shoot my videos walking around East London, looking younger and fresher, we'll put the old one in the description. But it only got about 5,000 views because nobody knew who I was at the time. So now we are going to explain why housing is so expensive. And when I realized nobody had seen that old video, I was quite excited to do one because I think we can really learn a lot about some of the really common ways in which the way that we talk about and think about economics is kind of dumb and is kind of wrong. And also, I just think that this really, really important question is really, really commonly misunderstood, basically. So I want to explain in some quite simple ways why the way that you think about housing and the way that you think about the expensiveness of housing is wrong. Okay, so the first thing you need to understand about the expensiveness of housing is that it is a global issue. And what you often see with housing and the expensiveness of housing is that people seem to think that it is something that is happening specifically in their city. And when you, as I have done, you study and work with people from all over the world and you travel around. And when I travel around, I always like to speak to people about the economy. Basically, everyone in pretty much every big city in the world thinks that there is a massive housing affordability problem specifically in their city. So this is true in London and in New York and in Los Angeles and in Tokyo and in Shanghai and in Rio de Janeiro and in Mumbai and in Melbourne and Sydney and Vancouver and Toronto. Like I could just keep listing cities and cities. And I was in Portugal and Lisbon and Porto. I was in Milan. Yeah, it's basically everywhere you go, people think that there is a housing crisis in just their city. And I think that is the first thing that can teach us something, which is that this is quite obviously, once you step back and get a bit of distance and look at it, this is quite obviously a global problem, which must therefore have a global cause. So for all of the guys out there who think this is specifically Sadiq Khan's fault, for those of you who don't know, Sadiq Khan is the mayor of London. I hate to break it to you, but this is happening everywhere. And if it's Sadiq Khan's fault, he must be a really powerful guy because this is happening in every city across the world. And there is a real tendency for people to think that the low affordability of housing in the city or the region that they live is being caused by their local mayor, is being caused by their local planning policy. That basically can't be true. If that was true, it wouldn't be happening in like pretty much every major city in the world. So that's your first clue that this is misunderstood. It's global, it's everywhere. So it doesn't make any logical sense to look specifically for the cause of the problem to something that's happening specifically in your town or your city, because it's not happening just there. So then next we can take a step back further. And I think this is probably the most interesting point I'm going to make in the whole video. So if you only take one thing away, listen to this. So first I've explained to you that the problem is not just in your city. The next thing that I'm going to explain, and I think this really helps us to understand what is going on here, is it's not happening just in houses. Maybe that isn't immediately clear what I mean. So at the beginning of COVID, and I've spoken about this a few times on the channel, I realized very quickly that the rich would accumulate a lot of money. And I knew for like relatively obvious reasons that was going to push asset prices up because rich people, when given money, tend to spend almost all of it on assets. So I went and put a massive bet on the gold price going up. And since the beginning of the gold price, I put that on at something like $1,400, $1,450 or something like that. And now, I don't even know, I think it's 2,500. I think it could be way more than that. I think it's, let me check actually. We can cut it in because I think it's something crazy now. 3,400. Yeah, so I put that on at 1,450, something like that. And now it's more than $3,300. So just since the beginning of COVID, 2020, you've seen in 5 years, the gold price go up about 2.5 times. So massive, massive increase in gold price. But it's not just gold, right? Like at the moment, Basically, every stock market in the entire world is at an all-time high. If you look at the US stock market, massive, massive all-time high. If you look at the German stock market, but also the gold price, land prices, you look at the price of farmland, it's gone through the roof. If you look at the price of even things like luxury art, luxury cars, like basically every asset in the world, obviously with some exceptions, but every sort of hard long-term asset has massively increased in price. Not just in the last 5 years since COVID, but the last 15 years since the Great Recession, the last 30 years. So when you step back and you get a bit of distance, what you see is what has happened to house prices and in housing is not at all unique to house prices and to housing. Like, just like it's not unique to your city, it's happening everywhere. It's not unique to housing, it's happening in basically every asset. What you have seen in the short term, the medium term, and the long term now is just a massive increase in the price of basically all assets when compared to things like wages. And I think this is the main way that it's misunderstood, right? Because the housing crisis, for very obvious, understandable reasons, the crisis of housing affordability is always thought about as a crisis of housing. And then the solutions and the causes and the reasons are always spoken about as if they are specific to the housing market. People always love to talk about they're not building enough houses. People like to say it's because of immigration. But if it's because of us not building enough houses, why is the gold price trebled? Why are the stock prices trebling? Why are land prices, quadrupling? This is a global asset price crisis. It doesn't make any sense. If you walk into the supermarket and the price of everything has trebled, and then you pick up the coffee and you say, why has coffee trebled? And I say to you, that's because something crazy happened in the coffee market. And this, by the way, is exactly what happened during COVID. So at the beginning of COVID, it was very clear there was going to be a big increase in inequality, a big cash accumulation by the rich. And I was able to predict, if you don't believe me, go and watch the first video on the channel. I was able to predict as early as March 2020 that there would be a massive inflation crisis and that prices of everything would go up. And yet when the inflation crisis actually happened, people had a real tendency to be like, well, the coffee price has gone up because something weird's happened to coffee, and the price of sugar's gone up because something weird has happened to sugar, and the rents have gone up because something weird has happened to the rent market, and holidays have got more expensive because something weird has happened in the holiday market. And I think this is a really classic example of a very, very common way in which economists and journalists who talk about economics understand poorly and explain poorly the economy, which is they love to look at kind of small picture explanations. For example, if something's happened to house prices, it must come from the housing market. And they're very generally unable to see like big picture causes. Because it's not that hard to recognize, well, house prices have gone up, but so have all other assets. So really what's actually happened is an asset price crisis. But economists just never look at this basically. And you end up with these basically wrong explanations, which is the problem is we're not building enough houses. The problem is immigrants. The housing crisis is not a housing crisis. The housing crisis is a crisis of asset affordability. All asset prices have gone up enormously, and that means you can't afford them. Now we're going to explain why. So to explain why, it's very, very simple really. I can do it in one sentence. When you give rich people money, they buy assets. Okay, I'm not Jeff Bezos, I'm not a billionaire. I'm like I suppose you could say like moderately rich person. If you were to give me 100 grand, I could tell you exactly, I would go that day and buy 100 grand of assets. That is what I would do because I have enough money to live my life. I don't need any more money. I don't need to spend any more money because I'm relatively rich. I have everything that I need. If you give me 100 grand, I will buy 100 grand of assets. And that is true for the vast majority of rich people. If you give rich people a ton of money, they buy assets, that's where it goes. So when we saw at the beginning of COVID, what should have been relatively clear, it is still not often spoken about. When we saw that rich people were going to accumulate trillions of dollars, pounds, euros, it should have immediately been extremely obvious that house prices would go up. Like nothing could be more obvious, right? If we give £1 trillion to the richest people in the country, obviously, of course, house prices and stock prices and the gold price will go up. This is nothing could be more obvious. And for the basic simple reason, you are competing with billionaires and multimillionaires for ownership of the assets. So if these guys start to accumulate enormous amounts of money, the asset prices will go up and you will get less and they will get more. And this is what is happening in housing. This is what is happening in housing. The rich accumulated a ton of money during COVID, but that is just a continuation of a pre-existing trend, which was the rich are getting richer and richer and richer and richer as they accumulate larger and larger and larger ownership of wealth. That generates for them more and more and more passive income, and there's basically nothing they can do with that passive income other than to buy the rest of the wealth. And that is why you're seeing house prices going up. That is why you're seeing stock prices going up. That is why you're seeing land prices going up. That's why you're basically seeing all prices going up. These guys have tons of money that they need to do something with, and they're using that to buy assets. And that is really why housing is expensive. But one thing I think that kind of obscures this a little bit is if we were to talk about gold or housing, it would kind of be obviously true. If you give rich people a ton of money, they're going to go and buy gold. They're going to go and buy if you talk about gold or the stock market, it's going to be obviously true. They're going to buy gold and stocks. But when you look at housing is actually quite a special asset in the context of Western economies, especially here in the UK, especially in the US, for example. Housing is the asset which is most likely to be owned by ordinary people. So most people don't have enormous stock market portfolios, but a lot of ordinary people still in this country, in the US, in a lot of Western countries, own their own house, which may in many cases nowadays be worth £500,000, £1 million. So what you have here is the fact that there seems to be a kind of conflict, right? Because even though we know rich people buy tons and tons of stocks, rich people don't appear to directly buy tons and tons of housing. And what you're seeing here is basically, this is what I did a video on mortgages earlier this year. And I really wanted to do that video because basically mortgages are the way in which rich people buy and own your house. So I've got a whole video on that. So if you want to go and watch the mortgage video now or afterwards, you can watch that. But mortgages is a balanced system. The amount of money lent in society equals the amount of money borrowed. So we've clearly seen that the average size of a mortgage has massively, massively increased, which means your average person, your average family here in the UK, in the US, across the world, has this massive mortgage debt. Something people don't realize is if one group of society has a massive debt, then somebody else has to accumulate a ton of money. This is the way that debt works. You cannot be in debt to nobody. So it is only possible for ordinary people to suddenly have these massive, massive, massive mortgages if there is a group in society that is suddenly accumulating this massive amount of money, this massive amount of credit. So probably the easiest way I think to visualize that is, say I'm a rich person, I've got £1 million cash spare. I can do two things with that. I can either go and buy the house, or I can lend it to my sister who buys the house. The end result on the price of houses is exactly the same. So rich people are pushing up the prices of all assets, including housing. But when they push up the price of housing, it often comes through this channel of mortgage lending. And the reason you are seeing mortgages get much, much, much bigger is because rich people are pushing up the house prices, but they are also simultaneously offering large amounts of mortgage lending. So it gets a bit obscured by mortgages, but the simple truth of the matter is really simple, right? You know, if you are Rishi Sunak, if you are Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Donald Trump, you know, you can only live in 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 houses, but you can own, especially via the channel of mortgage lending and owning credit, you can own 1,000 houses, you can own 10,000 houses. And it's the same with the government, you know, they're lending money to the government, that's the way they're taking possession essentially of government assets. They're lending money to mortgage borrowers, that's the way they're taking possession of housing assets, and in things like stocks and shares and land and gold, they directly buy these things. If you look, this is another point I want to make. People often look at the current level of unaffordability of housing and they look at graphs such as house price versus average wage. And they see that in the last 10, 20, 30 years, the average house price in the UK, for example, has become extremely expensive relative to wages compared to what it was 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And they often then say, oh, well, that means housing now is unsustainably expensive. It is unaffordable for ordinary people and house prices will have to come down. Go and look at what housing affordability is like in the West, in London, in New York, compared to extremely unequal places in the world like Mumbai, like Shanghai, like Hong Kong, like Rio de Janeiro, like Sao Paulo, or compared to what housing affordability was like here in the UK 100 or 200 years ago when things were unequal. What you will find is the historic outlier is actually not now when housing is very unaffordable. The historic outlier is that period after the Second World War when housing was affordable. If you read about the history of the UK or Europe, if you read your Dickens, you will see that for most of history, housing was not affordable. And that was because for most of history, we had very high levels of inequality. We had this dip in inequality in the post-war period. And what that literally means is that dip in wealth inequality means assets being owned by ordinary people. Now we've moved towards a much more unequal society. The rich are much richer, ordinary people are much poorer. What that means is you are increasingly competing with billionaires and multimillionaires with enormous amounts of passive income for ownership of the houses, and you can't compete with them. And housing will continue to get more and more unaffordable as long as inequality increases, which it is doing and which it will continue to do. So the reason house prices are expensive is because the rich are really, 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 really rich now, and you can't compete with them. And unless you do something about that, you won't be able to. All right, so this is the untold story of housing, the untold story of unaffordability of housing, which is the real truth is what you're simply seeing is a change in distribution, a change in inequality, a change in relative power. You're losing, they're winning. So what does that mean about the kind of commonly given stories about housing? The biggest one in this country is definitely just build more, just build more, just build more. This idea that housing is expensive. You should just build more houses. So let's discuss that. So before we shot this video, I just quickly went out onto my balcony over there and I did a little count of how many cranes I could see. I counted 13 cranes out there, just what I can see from my balcony. So we are building more. We are building more. And if you go out to Ilford, where I grew up, which is a very poor, Central Ilford is a very, very poor, low wage, low rent area of outer East London. They are just building and building and building. There's like a 40-floor skyscraper of flats in one of the poorest parts of London, and they're just everywhere. We are building them. We are building them. But if you exist in a world where all asset prices are increasing aggressively quickly, and that is what is driving house prices, how many houses do you think you need to build here in London to stop or reverse a global massive increase in the cost of all assets? It's not possible. If your town is being flooded, you are not going to save your house by just bailing your bucket out. You need to deal with the massive increase here. And I think what you are seeing, and I see this all the time in economics and politics, is this aggressive focus on small scale issues with this increasingly absurd refusal to deal with what is driving it. Inequality is increasing. Inequality is increasing rapidly. What that means is you get less, they get more, and it means your house will be unaffordable. You're not going to deal with that by building more houses. You need to deal with that by stopping the inequality growth. Okay, but what if you do build more? Because we are building more, we will build more. I want to talk a little bit, and I have mentioned it before on the channel, about what inequality does to the physical shape of cities and to the physical shape of countries. When you live in a relatively equal country, everybody's got some money, everybody's got some wealth, everybody is a worker, everybody is a producer, and everybody is also a consumer. And that means wherever you have a village or a city or a town, you have workers and consumers, because everybody is a worker and everybody is a consumer. But once you move towards very unequal economies, then you get like a splitting of workers and consumers. All of the wealth, all of the economic power, all of the spending power starts to be concentrated in a small elite, and they are the people who can spend, and everybody else has nothing. And that creates an imbalance, right? Because if everybody's a worker and everybody's a spender, then any town, any city is balanced. It has both workers and spenders. Once you split those people, then suddenly you don't own your own home, you're kind of poor, there's only a small amount of people who have money, you need to live near them because that's the only place to get a job. And that's how you see a kind of shape of country and a shape of city, which is really, really common in poorer countries, in anywhere really, Latin America, most of Africa, Southeast Asia, where you have these cities which have unbelievably luxurious centres surrounded by massive slums, basically. That is the shape that an unequal economy wants to be, right? Because if the rich have all the spending power, then of course they want a super luxury place to live, so they will build that, and everybody else needs to sort of swarm around them. That is what our economy wants to look like, because here in Europe, we have moved from that relatively equal 60s, 70s, 80s period towards a very unequal economy now, and it is becoming more unequal. So you're starting to see this economic drive to build these very unequal countries, these very unequal cities. And that is why people are saying build more, build more, build more. I think we should be very careful. I grew up in one of these areas outside the big city. These places are being very, very aggressively, very rapidly slumified. There's lots of enormously low quality housing being built up. I think you should be careful supporting these build policies that are not addressing the growing inequality, because if you do that, you will make places like London and places like all of the big cities across Europe, you will make them start to look more like Mumbai and like Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo with massive slums. I would like to protect more the ability of people to live where they want. I don't think people should be forced to all live in the city or live in the massive cities. And to do that, you need to address the growing inequality, not just build more. But beyond that, I think there is a really phenomenal and quite interesting naivety to this build approach, which really mirrors the phenomenal naivety that we're seeing in a lot of mainstream economic discourse at the moment about the weakness of the economy overall. So, we have this new Labour government in this country, and their approach is growth. They've got these posters out there that say growth. And it mirrors this commonly popular idea about the housing market, which is build. And it kind of, it seems, is based on this assumption that you can just go and you can just build the house, or you can just go and you can grow the economy, as if there's a bunch of resources lying around, as if there's like a million builders sitting on the side twiddling their thumbs with a bunch of concrete, and you can just bring them in and get them to start building. We do not live in economies full of unused resources. We live in very efficient economies where basically all resources are used, and the vast majority of those resources are owned by the rich, and the vast majority of those resources are used by the rich. And if you are a rich person now, you control the resources we need to build more houses, and you get to choose what you're going to do with those resources. Are you going to build affordable housing for ordinary people? You're in this economy where you can rapidly see the shifting power dynamics in the economy. The government is dying on its arse, right? And that's not just the UK. Governments are dying on their arse all over the world, right? Government is collapsing. The working class is just devastated. The middle class is increasingly impoverished. And you have this small group of super wealthy people who are just aggressively getting richer and richer. And you are a rich guy with some resources that you get to choose what to do with. And you're running a company. If you were running a company now, building company, construction company, in this economic context of a collapsing middle, collapsing government, collapsing poor, absolutely skyrocketing wealth of the rich, what kind of housing are you going to build? You are going to build super luxury housing for super rich people because they are obviously the guys with the money, right? It's obviously, and then when it comes to ordinary people's housing, you're going to give them the cheapest possible thing because you know that they have very, very little money and they basically have to buy whatever they can give you. We need to deal with this absurdly simplistic view of economics, which says things like build, grow, as if that is not what every government for the last 30, 35 years all over the world has been constantly trying to do and failing. The problem here is not enough building. The problem here is not enough growth. The problem here is rapid and aggressive changing in distribution and changing in your relative power position. If you are not a super rich person, you are the group that is losing, and that means you get less housing. It's as simple as that. Build. It's not going to work. I often think when I hear politicians say build. When I go back to the house I grew up in, there's a massive block of flats now. I grew up in sort of a traditional terraced, small row of terraced houses. There's a massive block of flats there now. I'm blocking out the sun. And the street I grew up in is basically a slum now. I always wonder when they say build, 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 these politicians, are they going to build massive blocks of flats overlooking their houses? Or are they going to build massive blocks of flats of extremely low quality housing overlooking your house? And that brings me to my final point I want to make, which is the idea that we just need to slash red tape. We just need to let them build. We just need to let them build. So for those who are not watching in the UK, everyone in the UK will know, we had the massive disaster in this country, in this city 8 years ago, which was when a block of flats burnt down. It's known as the Grenfell disaster, and 72 people died. And it turned out that not just that block of flats, but flats all over the country, including the building that I'm talking to you from, had basically unsafe materials used in the building construction, and that buildings all over the country were not safe from fire. Listen, I'm not a red tape guy. Do you really think that the best way to improve housing affordability is to slash safety standards? I think it's probably not the right way to do it. All right, so that brings us to an end of this first video on housing. I can't believe I've not done one for so long. Listen, build, 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 grow, grow, grow. Always begs the question, with whose money? Because the rich own those resources that you need to build. Why on earth would they give those resources to you? They have a choice over what to build. They have a choice over how to use those resources. And you have a choice as well. You know, you can try to borrow from them at rates of interest which have to compete with financial markets that want to build shit for the rich. You'll lose money, you'll run a loss, governments will be bankrupted. If you're losing your resources every single day, every single year, you will get poorer. And that means less housing, it also means less healthcare, it means less education. If you want to stop that, the only way to realistically do it is to deal with the fact that you are losing resources. You cannot live in a country and an economy which is not growing, where the rich get richer and richer and richer and richer, and not expect to get poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer. The reason you're losing your housing is the same reason you're losing your healthcare. It's the same reason you're losing your education. It's the same reason that you're unable to get good jobs. It's because you are being squeezed out by the rapid, unbelievably rapid growth in wealth and luxury and living standards of the rich. You don't fight that fight, you lose your wealth, you lose your resources, you lose your living standards, you lose your housing. So, in answer to our opening question, why is housing expensive? It's because the rich are buying it all and you can't compete with them. The way to deal with that is to tax the rich more, to tax working people less. That is why we campaign here to tax wealth, not work. Support us, send this video to your friends, send it to your mum. Doesn't have to get worse, it can get better, but you're gonna have to make it happen yourself. Good luck.